Hi, my name is Paige and I'm an art student at Northwestern College. This is a demonstration on different ways that you can add texture to your ceramics. To begin, I'm going to show you how to make stamps using clay that you can use on other ceramic pieces to add texture to them. In order to start making your stamps, you need to gather some tools, including clay, and then any other pottery tools that you want to use to create your stamps. You can also use regular household items like buttons or rocks or anything that you want to push into the clay to make a stamp or design. In order to make the actual stamp, you start by wedging the clay, making sure the clay particles are going in the same direction and all the air bubbles are out. And then you're going to make rectangular cubes in order to be like the actual stamp part that you hold. And so you can see in the picture that I've started to form into my rectangular cube so that I can add the design on top. So for making stamps, you can either press into the clay or you can add clay on top, depending on what kind of stamp you're looking for, what kind of look you're going for on your pottery. In this one, I have pressed into the clay to make a design, and so when I actually use the stamp and put it on the pottery, the design will come out. As far as making a stamp that will leave an imprint rather than something that comes out at you goes, you'll do the opposite. Instead of imprinting the stamp, you'll actually add clay to the stamp so that it will imprint into the pottery. And so the first steps are the same. You use a rectangular cube, and then for this one we are going to slip and score to actually add clay onto the stamp. So you'll see in the pictures, the first step that you do is you scratch up the clay. That is called scoring it, and then you will add slip to it. And then after that you'll add the actual pieces of clay that you want to make the design with. And the reason for doing this is just to make sure that we have a really good seal on the clay and so that air bubbles don't get in, because if that happens they could blow up once you put them in the kiln. And then here I use some tools just to help me smooth out the pieces of clay onto the stamp. You can use whatever you'd like just to make sure that you have correctly placed them together. Here are the stamps that I made completed. Now they are ready to be put in the kiln, fired, and after that we can use them to add texture to our pottery. After your stamps have been fired, they are ready to be used. You can either just press them into a slab of clay, or you can throw a wheel on the pot and carefully press them into that. One of the tips that I have with doing this is just making sure that you put even pressure on all sides. There were a few times that I would put too much pressure on the top of the stamp and the bottom of the stamp wouldn't really show up. And so just making sure you have even pressure all the way around as you press into the clay. Here are some of the examples of the stamps that I made. You'll see that you can use them just by themselves, or you could use them together, or you could also stamp and then like rotate it, stamp again, stamp again. So you'll see there's like, you could do a small design or do multiples of the same stamp and make a larger design. The next thing that we're going to look at is how to make a ceramic textured rolling pin. The reason that you'd want to do this is if you have like you're making a slab pot and you want a continuous texture over the whole thing without having to stamp a billion times. And so we'll look at how to make that. So to start making the rolling pin, you're going to use a clay press and push clay into it. And if you look at the picture, you'll see I selected a plate that has 4 round circles, and I just used the biggest one in order to make a rolling pin that has a really thick diameter. And you'll just press the clay through that to make a clay tube, and that's what we'll use to make our rolling pin. So after you do that, you should have a perfectly round tube of clay, and that is what we'll use to either press into and apply texture or build on and add texture to it. As far as adding texture goes, we're using the same techniques that we did with the stamps, but you just go all the way around the tube instead of just on one side of it. So after you complete the design that you want on your rolling pin, it's ready to be fired, so you can go ahead and fire it. And after that's done, then you're ready to use it on a slab of clay. You'll see in the pictures me demonstrating how to do this. First you roll out your slab, and then you go ahead and start at the bottom and move the rolling pin from the bottom to the top, pressing firmly, and you want to make sure that you apply even pressure on all sides of the rolling pin. That way the texture is uniformly imprinted into the clay. You can kind of plan out where you want to roll your stamp. What I did for this particular project is I did the stamp and then I went back and rolled over it in a different direction just to add more texture. So you can kind of play with your rolling pin and how you want your slab to look. And then you'll see in the picture that I cut my slab out of the clay that I imprinted my design on, and then I used those pieces to build a slab pot. After my slab pot was constructed, I went back with the rolling pin and went over the corners and the edges where I had to put the slabs together in order just to add more texture. And a tip that I would say is really make sure you go over the corners to make sure that the texture gets all the way to the top and the bottom of the slab. And if you support the back of your slab with your hand and roll over the slab with your rolling pin, it really adds a lot more texture than if you were just to use what you had did when you rolled it on the regular tab and just put it together. I think it's really important to go back over it and just make sure that you really got a good imprint on each individual slab that is on the slab pot. So what you just saw is different ways that you could use clay to imprint texture on other clay. Now we're going to move on to looking at how you can add texture using negative space. So to begin, I started with a pot that I made by throwing it on the wheel, and then we're also going to use a needle tool. You'll see I used the needle tool to kind of plan out where I wanted my negative space to be within my bowl, and so that's what you'll see here. I'm going around and marking the places that I'm going to be cutting out. And then I use the same tool to actually go around and cut circles out of the clay. And you'll see in the picture that I went back over all the circles and smoothed the clay out with my finger so that there wasn't rough edges around it. You can really cut out however little or however much you want. The more that you cut out, the more texture that it adds to the pottery, and so that's something to keep in mind when deciding how textural you want your ceramic pottery to be. The next thing we're going to look at is how to add texture by actually manipulating the clay itself. So for this I used a piece of pottery that was freshly thrown off the wheel, and I would say you could do it like that. I would suggest after doing it myself that I probably would have preferred to wait a little bit so that the clay had a little bit of time to dry out. There are a lot of different ways that you can manipulate the clay to add texture. For this particular project I just kind of poked at it with my finger, and it's really important while you're doing this to support both sides of the clay. So if you're adding texture to the outside of the pot, make sure you support the inside with your other hand. That way the pot doesn't crack while you're adding texture to it. The final way that I'm going to talk about adding texture today is by adding texture to the surface of the pot by adding other clay onto it. We're going to use some of the same techniques that we used in adding clay onto the stamp and adding clay onto the rolling pin. So we'll start with your basic slab pot, and we're going to use the metal smoothing tool just to smooth out the clay. Make sure that you get the texture of the canvas out of it so it can be a really smooth surface that we start with. And then you'll see in the picture we're going to start by kind of tracing out where we want to add the texture to the slab pot. We're going to use the needle tool to do that, and just like we did in the previous examples of texture, we are going to score the surface where we will be adding the clay to add texture. We will put slip where we scored, and then we'll begin to add the actual pieces of clay that will become the texture on the surface of the pottery. And then you will continue to follow those 3 steps, slipping and scoring and adding clay, until your whole surface or the part that you want to be covered with texture has been completely covered. Also, it's important to remember to support the back of the slab while you're adding the texture on to the surface of the pottery. Once you have added texture to the entire area of the pot that you want to, then you're done and your pot is ready to be fired.